What's up, everybody? Welcome in to DodgerHeads presented by DodgerBlue.com. My name is Jeff Spiegel, joined today once again by Lance Brozdowski. Lance, we appreciate the time here to talk some pitching, metrics, nerdy stuff, and
Yeah,
your
a
last
lot of nerd stuff.
so popular. We're glad to have you back.
I appreciate that. Yeah, thanks for having me on again. It's always fun to talk Dodgers ball. I feel like I'm always looking at stuff they're doing because they're a fascinating org. So I might be a frequent guest on here. It seems.
I love it. I love it. Well, and you cut you're sort of your main thing is talking about the Cubs. If you're not talking about all of Major League Baseball, so we were
Yeah,
joking we might have to have you on in a week because there's a pathway where it's Dodgers Cubs in the NLDS.
there is for sure. The Cubs are kind of limping around right now, but we'll see what exactly happens with this weekend series in with Milwaukee, and then we'll see from there. But yeah, that'd be an interesting series. Bellinger revenge tour. I don't know if it's a revenge tour really, but
Yeah.
something along those lines.
Well, let's get into it. The first question I want to ask you is sort of what's interesting about the Dodgers as we look ahead to the NLDS and NLCS is we kind of know the names that are going to be involved. It's more about what order they get used and philosophies about piggybacking and stuff. So let's start at the beginning. I think the conversation right now, the two guys we know are starting game 1 and game 2 of the NLDS whenever that happens are Clayton Kershaw and Bobby Miller. And realistically, I don't know if there's two pitchers in the same conversation that are more opposite. You have a veteran versus a rookie. You have a guy who's throwing 87 versus a guy who's throwing 100. You have a guy who, is giving up no runs versus a guy who maybe is giving up more runs than you would like in Miller. So take this wherever you want. But when you think about Clayton Kershaw and when you think about Bobby Miller, how do you compare these two guys? How would you think about making a decision here?
Yeah, this is a tough one because I think at the end of the day, it comes down to Kershaw health.
Yeah.
And that is something that you're probably only going to know internally in the Dodgers in terms of whatever they're looking at on a bullpen to bullpen basis with him, how often he throws off mound between starts, and how much layoff between, last time he's on the mound relative to now when he will potentially start in the postseason, and what they think internally about him. The thing is, like on the public side here, we can't really do too much, right? We can assume a lot of things. Like the velo's down is just going to lose margin for error. I get Kershaw is like an anomaly in a lot of respects. He doesn't really throw hard. It's cut right four seam. It's funky. He hides everything well. It works. So velo for a guy like him, in my opinion, probably isn't as important as it would be for a guy like Bobby Miller, who like still has really strong shapes, but velo is driving a lot of his stuff grade, so to speak.
Yeah.
So I get like velo down with Kershaw limits margin for error, but how much velo's down? How much can they sequence around it? How confident are they in him pitching well despite velo being down? Is the variable here that we can speculate on as much as we want, but the reality is I don't think there's going to be a good answer to it. And because of that, I probably lean Bobby Miller off game 1. He's just been a great pitcher this year overall. I mean, his stuff pops. It's good. It's multiple pitches that could get swing miss. Again, a lot of it is driven by velocity to some extent, which isn't a problem. It's just probably more of a thing long term of like, okay, if there's any point in when he's 29, 30, when the velo starts to tail off, like has he picked up enough pitchability and innate command by that point to be able to settle around, say, 96 and dot things? And that's a totally fair point, but it's not something you have to answer as a Dodger fan or the Dodgers front office heading into a postseason series where I wouldn't be surprised if he's up like 0.5 miles per hour or so, and it just gets even better. They use general central targets around a guy like him. They work with the sweeper off the kind of shorter slider, the Dodgers slider, I call it. Works really well. I think I'd just go Bobby Miller. Like, I get you have the veteran presence of Clayton Kershaw, and like he's done it before, and like the postseason performance isn't as bad if you remove certain instances of him performing poorly. But I just think I take the better pitcher right now. And to my eye, it's Bobby Miller. But again, like if they see something internally on Kershaw they like and think he's corrected, then I could see having the confidence to go with him. But on the public side, we'll know pretty quickly off like the Savant data and StatCast data how he looks if they were to put Kershaw out there. And then we'll see the performance off that and understand whether it was a good play or a bad play. You can maybe bring in some matchup stuff too based off who they're playing. I do think a guy like Bobby Miller, talk about the Cubs. The Cubs aren't a particularly good team versus four-seam fastballs this year, which is a real oddity that I can't really place. Very good versus breaking balls, not good versus four-seam. So in that case, I think I'd lean Bobby from a matchup perspective because they hit lefties, I think, pretty evenly with righties in the Cubs case. But that's for another day if they actually end up matching up. I just think a lot of teams are going to hammer the Cubs with four-seam fastballs and see if this team could turn it around. So in that case, I just take Bobby and see what you can do with his four-seam or sink.
One of the narratives we always hear about, velocity plays up in the postseason. As a guy who studies pitching, I mean, is there real truth to that? Because obviously, if that's the case, we're talking about an 87 versus a 100-mile-an-hour fastball And if velocity does matter, exponentially more or even marginally more in the postseason, again, that would seem to tilt in favor of a guy like Bobby Miller.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think on the broad stroke, velocity in terms of what makes a pitcher good or successful is probably the largest piece of the pie. But it's not the only piece of the pie, and that's where we get caught up a ton, I think. Is
Yeah.
like people saying, like the broad sweeping statement of velocity matters more than anything is probably true. Like we have data to back that up. Like it's not really, I don't think it's really too much of a debate. Honestly, it's funny when we get into debates about it. But it's like it's a piece, right? Like we're in an instance where we don't have to just look at velocity. Like I can also look at shape. We have general proxies for command on Enoceris's location plus model. You could also just look at heat maps. You can watch a pitcher or two and visually pick up how good he is at commanding the ball. It's like it's funny. We like having these debates where we like reduce all the information down to one stat and debate the one stat. It's like we don't really need to do that. Like we have everything else here. So that's why we have Stuff Plus, because we can distill down shape, release, what he's doing from the release, what's the break off the arm angle, and combine that with velocity. But if you're just creating a pitcher, velocity is the one thing I'd want to know. And I'm confident that would play out. When you get into a playoff atmosphere, I think what happens from a velocity perspective is you just use starters less, or your leashes are shorter. And therefore you bring in bullpen arms that generally throw harder than non-bullpen arms. So that's, I think, where you get the concept of velocity playing up for the most part. And I also think it's just an admission by the league that that's probably the way to approach things on a game-by-game basis throughout the season. If you want really good marginal gains as a team like the Rays, who just don't really let guys go past 6 innings for the most part. But it's just like, I guess teams don't really like doing that because you run into situations, not to bring up the Cubs again, but the Cubs have really overworked their bullpen this year and they're running into those problems now with it. So it's one of those things where it's like, okay, you ideally want to use the bullpen as much as possible, but when you don't have pieces to backfill if those guys get injured, or a team like the Rays always do, they pick up Robert Stevenson and make him one of the best relievers in baseball. They do it time and time again with these arms in the pen where it's like, they're a factory. So like, they don't really care if the guy goes down because they have others to backfill. But I just think it's a focus on velocity because it's a focus on what gives us the best chance of getting this individual out. And most of the time, you could probably go into the advanced scouting side, which I've done a little recently. It's fun. But again, on a matchup by matchup basis, maybe you can make arguments in other directions. But on the broad stroke, Velo's king.
All right. Well, let's move on to the number 3 starter. And this is admittedly probably more of a fun thing to talk about than realistically a conversation, but maybe I'm wrong. And it's the number 3 spot, and it's Lance Lynn and Ryan Pepiot would be the 2 guys I would throw in here. We've got Lance Lynn, who we know about the first few starts with the Dodgers, incredible. We know about the next few starts, atrocious. The last 2, 6 strikeouts in both of those. That was kind of the key indicator to me that something was up. He started striking out 1 guy, 2 guys per outing. So he gets back-to-back starts with 6, and yet he's still giving up home runs. But the earned runs are better. 7 earned runs in his last 18-inning pitch. Pepiot on the other side, I don't know how much, I feel like I don't talk about Ryan Pepiot enough. Every time I look at the numbers, he's made 7 starts / bulk appearances. He's allowed 1 or fewer earned runs in 6 of the 7. He's gone 6+ innings pitched in 4 straight. He has a 35-3 strikeout to walk rate this season, a whip of .74. It's kind of crazy to me that we're even debating whether or not this guy should be the number 3 starter. It feels like he should be in the first category.
I agree. The answer here is probably just Lance Lynn. I just don't think they're going to give it to Pepiot. But it's more fun, in my opinion, to think about Pepiot as a starting pitcher going forward. I loved Pepiot for a while. I just think the changeup's really good. I think the fastball's good. I think the slider works. It's just a 3-pitch mix that I like. The thing with Pepiot that I find interesting is that he's not really in zone with anything slider or changeup. So it's a lot of fastball. And I think this gets into that balance of throw your best pitch the most. But again, that's another thing like velocity where you also have to consider how much that best pitch is in the zone and competitive. And the reality is sometimes changeups are honestly changeups are in zone less than sliders for the most part. If you look on the broad stroke, I think even less than sweepers too. Generally they're chase pitches out of the zone. Look at Kodai Senga's splitter. That thing's in the zone 20% of the time. Wow. And it just doesn't matter. And I find that fascinating because you kind of have to, I think there's a floor with Pepiot's fastball usage, even though the pitch is not as good as the slider or changeup in terms of allowing damage. It still works. It's not a bad pitch. But if you were to idealistically think about Pepiot, it's okay, I think of him as how low can you get the fastball usage without sending the walk rate through the roof to the point where he's not a starter anymore. Right now, I think they've settled just above 50%. You look at other guys who have maybe more in zone ability with their breakers. And I think you could probably get it down to like 38. I was looking at like Tariq Skubal the other day. He's a guy that's like 38% fastball, but he
Okay.
locates everything else well enough to like make up for the fact that the fastball doesn't need to be in the zone. So Pepio is not that case. So I'm not exactly sure where the four seam usage, what is the floor of the four seam usage? I imagine the Dodgers are going to try to push up against it. The other thing I'll mention too, I've been doing a bit of advanced scouting. I posted some YouTube videos about this. I'm going to post one on the Dodgers actually recently. I'll talk about how to pitch to Mookie Betts and Freddie Freeman, which is basically impossible, but it'll be fun. I did a really long one on the Orioles, but one of the things that I find really interesting, and this applies to Mookie Betts too, and I think it'll apply back to Pepio. There's some really good hitters in baseball who aren't particularly good right changeups. And I find this interesting because Mookie Betts is a guy who covers everything in the zone for the most part. But if you look at his performance against changeups, it's actually not particularly strong. There's a couple other really good hitters in baseball too, Ronald Acuna being one of them, where I kind of thought that was a reasonable approach, just throw changeup. So Pepio to me becomes a really interesting matchup weapon because he has that ability to throw changeups right. Where it might be crazy to say like I'd actually prefer Pepio against some of the better hitters on other teams, but like I think there's something to whether it be not seeing the pitch a ton or just not seeing a lot of right changeups that throws hitters off. Where I'd be comfortable almost using and playing the number scheme here and using a Pepio versus like an Acuna in a spot that I like need just kind of not slug or swing miss because he doesn't swing and miss regardless. So you're not going to get him to swing and miss. So I'm looking at like where can I get him to put the ball on the ground weekly? And your best bet sometimes is a changeup with Acuna and Pepio on this team, even like a Gavin Stone. That's a little more scary of a proposition, I think. But Ryan Pepio changeup right. Like I would have him pepper that, and I think a lot of really good right-handed hitters would be a bit kind of off based on how they've been pitched prior in the season. So I like Pepio from a matchup standpoint. It's crazy to think Lynn doesn't make that start in game 3.
Yeah. And the thing about Pepio is kind of what you're referring to. Like walks were his issue last year. Like when he has been up at the major leagues, it's like you just got to throw strikes. That's why 35-3 strikeout to walk ratio is just an incredible improvement. And it's positive because it's like, look at the results. Like you're not walking anybody. And the results have been pretty good. Is it sustainable? I think is, kind of the big question.
They've done a great job. I got to poke around and see exactly what they did because I didn't really see anything drastically different with like release or extension or shapes. I think the slider's a little bit harder, but we've seen that with pretty much every pitcher who comes up to the major league level. Bobby Miller's slider increased in velocity progressively throughout the season. So I'm not entirely sure what they did there, but maybe it was just like a lot of the times too, I'm not speculating here. I don't actually know, but sometimes guys are just working through injury or they start late in their throwing programs in the offseason. And sometimes that pushes into the season. And I wonder whether he just had a good offseason and then ramped up properly. And now all of a sudden he's like what you thought he was going to be 2 years ago. That stuff's often hard. There's just no reporting on it, especially in the minor leagues or guys in up down, where like Pepio, I think was last year, if I'm remembering correctly. I wonder whether he's just healthy and on target and he's just pitching better.
Yeah. Yeah. And obviously him, it's the weird one where him missing the beginning of the season in many ways probably has helped him because they're not worrying about the inning limit. And I do think there was an element of like, there was no opening day that was just looming. And it's like, hey, you got to be ready whether or not you're actually ready on this date. They were able to say, take your time. At first it was like, oh, he's going to be out a month or two. It ended up being a lot longer, but maybe that just gave him space to actually get runway, to get healthy, to get strong. Let me ask you real quick on Lance Lynn. I mentioned the last 2 starts have seemingly been better. Is there anything like what change? Like, how does he go from really good to really bad to like sort of really good? No, I wouldn't say this. Probably not really good, but super acceptable. We'll call the last 2 outings from Lance Lynn. I think he's given up a home run in like 6 straight, but we just resigned ourselves to home runs from Lance Lynn.
Yeah,
we agree that he's almost assuredly going to be the game 3 starter. Should I be worried as a Dodgers fan if Lance Lynn takes the ball in game 3?
Yeah, I'm looking up right now to see. The one thing that I found interesting, he's still throwing a ton of four seam. He's like 60% four seam in these last 2 starts. The four seam just hasn't been great versus righties. I just don't think there's a lot of margin for miss on it anymore. And I don't know if his command is just maybe deteriorating over time, but it's just not as good of a pitch and it's still kind of getting beat up. Some of the underlying stuff there is decent. Cutter looks okay. The thing that I found interesting, and I got to toggle to see if he increased the usage. I thought the sinker to righties looked pretty good. So if he's struggling with righties, I imagine it's one of those things where they're just trying to optimize the usage against particular lineups and do a really good job of advanced reporting and scouting those teams and how to match up guys. I think honestly that's probably the byproduct of Lance Lynn. It's just I don't know if they necessarily change anything dramatically. I think we're going to talk about Ryan Yarbrough at some point here, but like he's another one where I just think it's a mixed change. I think they've done that with Lance Lynn. I think they're just kind of taking maybe a sharper approach to advanced scouting and prepping and game prepping for him than maybe the White Sox did. And it's worked in some instances and hasn't in others. But like you're getting heavy four seam usage regardless. I was curious to see if the sinker usage would come up because the underlying stuff there was really good to righties specifically. I'm not sure if I can pull. Let's see how quickly I can stall and pull whether the usage there is up. So he's thrown it 12% of the time in his last 2 starts. Let's look at like the prior 4 quickly. Because like the underlying stuff on the sinker worked, and it also worked to get him something inside. The sinker was at 20%. So it's actually come down slightly, which is surprising to me. But I liked the sinker. I don't know if there's another reason why they don't want to throw that pitch, but I thought it worked, especially because he likes four-seam up away to righties. For me, thinking about that logic, like, okay, if you're righty, throwing to a righty, you're putting the fastball up away, natural miss is going to be in direction of pitch movement. It's going to take you back to the top of the zone, and that's where he's allowing damage. So in my perspective, I was like, if you're allowing damage up out of over the plate, like take the sinker and put it inside a little and see if you can get the hitter to stop doing that. I think Gavin Stone's the guy who actually started throwing a sinker this year. Bryce Miller started throwing a sinker on the Mariners. Very similar concept of like the four seam rides up, but like, let me see if I can bring something inside to make the four seam up away more effective. So I thought bringing up sinker usage might help the four seam. Dodgers don't seem to think that. They seem to just be relying more so on the four seam. So I'm going to guess it's a matchups thing, really. It just might be hard to prep for him from a hitter standpoint of like, where is he going to go? Is it going to be 60% four seam today? Is it going to be 35? And like, maybe you could back into that as like a team and see whether you could almost like try to galaxy brain. This is like the game theory of baseball that I find fascinating. He's like, okay, we know he's a 60% four seam guy. The Dodgers have liked that pitch. Is our right-handed crop of hitting, whoever they're facing, good enough that we think he'll go low four seam usage, or will he bring it to like 70% like he did in his first start against the A's, where it was just like, try to hit my four seam, I bet you can't, and they didn't. You know, so like that game theory is interesting. Is like the chess match of what will he do relative to the strength of himself versus the weakness of the team he's facing. So for me, that's what I'm looking at with Lynn. It's more a matchup thing. I think the variance there is pretty high. He could dominate, and I wouldn't be surprised, but I also think he could kind of get beat up, and then we might see Pepio in the 4th inning or something.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Ryan Yarbrough. Let's go to him. I think it's interesting. Can he be effective in the postseason? I think is the question. And I'll let you talk pitch mix. I was looking at his numbers, 3.12 ERA since coming over to the Dodgers, but that's been a 4.7 ERA over the last month or so. We know his deal. He's 10th. He has the 10th lowest fastball velocity in any pitcher that's pitched this year. That's like out of 690, he's 10th lowest. And yet, if you look up average exit velocity, Ryan Yarbrough has had the 11th best exit velocity among those 690 pitchers. So just a bizarre guy, but we just talked about velocity. Here is your child for the exact opposite. The expected numbers aren't awesome. And yet, like I said, since coming over to the Dodgers, the actual numbers have been pretty good.
They have, yeah. I mean, the first thing I'll say is like, in doing a lot of these pitcher notes this year, like looking through guys on a daily basis, the one thing I found is like, I do think a lot of the time we miss something with left-handed pitching. And I can't really quantify this, and I have no really objective info to back it up. I just feel like a lot of the times I look at stuff, stuff on Fangraphs, Stuff Plus. And most of the time I'm seeing overperformance of Stuff Plus. Anecdotally, I feel like it's coming from a left-handed pitcher.
Interesting.
And that could be a variety of reasons. Like generally throughout the minor leagues and as a guy develops as a hitter, you just don't see as much left-handed pitching. So I wonder whether there's like an added advantage there. There's also an angles advantage, again, from the prep standpoint. You often talk about like the mental map of pitches that hitters make as they progress through their careers. If you think just about that from a raw number perspective, like you're going to hit your mental map on righties as a right-handed hitter quicker than you are on lefties because you're just seeing more of them. So I think that you get the advantage there. The other thing, in relating back to what we were talking about with Lance Lynn, is just a mix change. I do think like you run in situations where the Dodgers add a cutter to Ryan Brazier and all of a sudden he's a great reliever. Like those are more notable changes, I would say, where it's like you could put your hat on something and go, boom, that's it. With Yarbrough, it's a mix change. Like they took the curveball and they brought the usage up to like 60% versus lefties. Clearly they like that pitch. I don't entirely know why. It grades out well, but it's really low velocity. So I just don't really understand that grade. And then to righties, he was throwing a ton of changeups with the Kansas City Royals. They basically tabled the changeup. That's like a 10%, 15% pitch now. And we're just like throw, sinker, cutter. And that gets at a larger point. I think, I've heard this concept in the past that like if you're a right-handed pitcher, I know Yarbrough's a lefty, but if you're a right-handed pitcher, strike out righties, limit contact versus lefties. Generally, the way you're going to limit contact from an opposite-handed perspective is to throw some kind of cutter, something that stays off barrel. You're generally ending up, lower exit velocity window, less chance for damage, not a ton of chance for swing and miss, and you probably play your batted ball luck. And I kind of feel like they did that with him, where it's just like, we just think the cutter's probably a slightly better pitch. We also think the range of outcomes is just tighter on it. So instead of throwing changeup, just throw sinker cutter, and we'll see how the cutter plays in zone. And it's played, I think, relatively well. I don't know if the expected stats there are amazing, but for the most part, I just think that they like cutter. I think we saw this with Lynn slightly too, where they brought up cutter usage. And it's a similar situation. It's just, I just think they want that to stay off barrel, and they like it. They like that idea of like strikeout same-handedness and just limit contact on opposite-handedness. And sometimes that just bores out, and like just change the mix. Like, I don't necessarily know whether the Royals were just slow on it or didn't want to do anything or what, but like, I love it when guys go to a new org and like immediately it's just like, that's exactly what the New York saw, and they implemented it perfectly. And the Dodgers do that all the time.
Yeah. With a guy like Yarbrough, quickly, we've talked a lot about the potential for the Dodgers to be piggybacking a lot of these guys. It's like, we can't figure out who their 3 or 4 best starters are, but we know who their best 8 starters are. And in my mind, as a guy who does not study pitching for a living, the idea of Bobby Miller throwing 100-mile-an-hour fastballs at you for 5 innings, and then Ryan Yarbrough coming in from the left-handed side and throwing, 86-mile-an-hour fastballs would be a nightmare to adjust to. Do the numbers bear that out? Like, is that a real thing, or is that just like, yeah, that would make sense, but the numbers don't actually reflect that?
I don't know if I have anything to tell you specifically here. The one thing I will say is, like, most of the time in those like anecdotal things, you probably need a massive sample to be able to bear it out and be confident that is predictive going forward. And I just don't think you're going to get that with something like that, unfortunately. But the thing I will say is, this is time and time again, I think I've run into situations where like I'll hear something over and over that counteracts generally what the large sample of data might say. I think of the example of this is maybe not perfect example, but scouts for the longest time always thought late movement existed, right? Data people basically said that was impossible, and they're dumb. And now we find out that seam shifted wakes exists, and we believe most of that movement comes late in ball flight. And scouts are like, we told you, like, we literally told you about this, but you have people who maybe don't have perfect information on the data side. And this is early 2000s for the most part is what I'm thinking, maybe like 2010s, where some teams are probably on the seam shifted wake movement, but just not totally there yet. And like, I feel like I hear that time and time again, like situational hitting is another one. I remember data is just like, what are you doing? Like, that's just dumb. Don't bunt, or don't do this, or don't try to change your approach with 2 strikes. And then you look at like Ronald Acuna this year in 2 strike counts. You look at Cody Bellinger in 2 strike counts. And then I was talking to someone this offseason who said like internally in their organization, they were going to slightly adjust how they value like B swing approaches. So like late count approaches where like, we actually don't think you have a high probability of ever hitting a home run here. So stop swinging as hard as you can. Where then the large data is just gonna be like, nope, take the A swing. Like, you want slug, we want home runs. And I think that applies back here, where it's like, on the whole, we don't think there's a large advantage to be had by a big velo differential from a new pitcher coming in. But like, maybe there is in a Yarbrough instance. Like, maybe the Dodgers see something where they like the matchups of like going to a Yarbrough after someone else. And it's just having confidence. It's almost like having confidence in a singular instance to go away from the larger data, what the larger data is saying. That, I think, is really hard to have. And it's hard to have from a process standpoint, too, where you can actually reflect and then learn and grow off of it. I think a lot of decisions counteracting data are made and then not reflected on. You're just like, don't like the data there, let's go in this direction. But I've always been fascinated by the idea of like logging decision-making for managers. Like, we want to bunt in this instance, tell me why, let's log it going forward and reflect, as opposed to just like, nope, got to wipe the slate clean next day, win today. It's like, I think there's a lot of info to be gleaned on like when these nuanced decisions are made and whether there's actually managers or front offices that are better at isolating off instances where they don't believe larger sample kind of applies.
Yeah, I love it. Well, I know you got to run here in a sec. Let me get one more question at you. Emmet Sheehan,
Do it.
24 strikeouts in his last 13.2 innings. He's allowed just 6 hits and 4 walks over that stretch. This is a guy who came straight from Double-A. I know we talked about him briefly, but it feels like he has actually gotten better. Like it's not like, oh, now they've adjusted, they know what it is. He's in this bulk role and nobody can touch his fastball.
Yeah, it's a low slot ride pitch. I mean, it's pretty modern in terms of how he approaches it. He's like a 5'4" release guy with 16 inches of vertical break. So he's like maybe 6 or so inches below the average release height, and he's getting average vertical break. It's really going to flatten out the approach of the ball at the zone. I mean, you can see this visually if you watch him too. It's funky. It's like tight arm circle, and then it just pops out. And it looks kind of like it's rising, so to speak, but that's really just a flattening out of the approach at the pitch at the zone. I think he's good. I think this goes back to what we were talking about with Pepio, where maybe there was just something off with him. I think the thing with Sheehan, and I believe he's mentioned this in some interviews, I think I saw him quoted once or twice, where it's like he was using a ball in AA that was like artificially giving him 2 inches of vertical break, and now he's using a completely different baseball. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's just like I wouldn't be shocked if like maybe he trained with that ball in the preseason and spring and every offseason. I imagine the Dodgers are like, we want you to be a starting pitcher, use Major League Baseballs. But like, if he's throwing every 5th day in Tulsa with a different ball, the AA uses a different ball. Like, I'm not shocked that you jump up a level and it affects a guy like him.
Yeah.
Whether that be biomechanically or just honestly, like mentally, like we throw aside the mental point, I think a lot because we can't really measure it on the data side. But like, I mean, I've talked to enough guys that like come across as just not having particular confidence in their stuff that you're like, yeah, maybe there's something there. Like the stuff says he's good, but that dude has no idea where the ball is going. That's not the case with Sheehan, but I think there could be something where it's like, man, I'd love to get a full offseason where I'm just using Major League Baseballs, and then I start my season and I'm just using Major League Baseballs again.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I do think his mix is a little simplified right now. I mean, he's like a purely 3-pitch guy. No, he's a 4-pitch guy. He's got a sweeper. They added the sweeper on the year. I remember thinking about that now. But I like him. I wonder kind of what the ultimate goal is here. Like, he drops down a ton for his sweeper. They must like it right. But again, this goes back to the point of like, he's also got a really good changeup. Like, I wonder whether versus like an Acuna type better right-handed hitters where they maybe use Sheehan and Pepio in instances where you may not expect it because of the flat approach fastball, but more so because they can throw right changeups that are weird and wacky and that like a Braves lineup might not be anticipating coming. I think Sheehan's good, and I think it's purely because of the fastball. And if you're betting on him, it's because of the fastball and then figuring out the rest of the repertoire around the fastball. I think he's getting a little unlucky on the changeup. Yes, like 700 slug there, but the extra was low. So that's gotten hit. Not entirely sure why. Kind of reminds me of Brandon Pfaadt, actually, in your guys' division, where like his changeup in the minors was great. He comes up to the majors and the thing's been terrible, and I have no idea why. Yeah. So like you'd expect the changeup probably to even back out for Sheehan, but they clearly like the fastball. He's thrown it 60% of the time, you know? Yeah. So they're leaning on that. And if you think he's a good starting pitcher, it's off the fastball.
Yeah, he had an appearance, I think it was last week, where he threw 24 pitches. He had 24 swings. He had 15 whiffs. But what I loved about it was that it was 5 whiffs on the fastball, 6 whiffs on the changeup, and 4 whiffs on the slider. So sometimes you see these guys where it's like Kershaw throws all these fastballs, gets no whiffs on his fastball, but then the slider, it's like 80% of his whiffs are on one pitch. To see Sheehan basically evenly distribute an absurd number of whiffs across 3 pitches was super encouraging.
Was that the Colorado start?
I'd have to go back and look on what the exact date was, because it was I think it might have been from a week ago, maybe even 2 weeks ago.
Because I saw they dominated in Colorado, and I got to look at what they did there because I imagine they did something different from a game planning standpoint because of how the altitude affects pitch movement. So they must have done something, and I haven't looked yet. But if anyone knows, I'd love to hear because I wouldn't be surprised if they just took one particular pitch or threw changeups, 20 percentage points more than they normally do because that's going to be more accentuated by the movement, by the high altitude and stuff. But yeah, they're a sharp team. They're probably playing around with some Coors experiments, I imagine.
Yeah, no, that'd be interesting. I think this might have been the Seattle game is the one that I was looking at. So from a couple of weeks ago. So anyways, well, hey, Lance, we really appreciate the time. Again, this stuff's really good. And maybe as we head towards the NLDS and get some more clarity on who's playing in that series against the Dodgers, we'll have you back on. Let folks know where they can find you at Lance Bros on social media, but let them know about the Substack.
Yeah, Substack, Lance Bros, that's Substack. Everything is Lance BROZ. So whatever platform you're on, I'm probably doing something. I do short form content on TikTok and stuff, which is very similar to kind of what I'm talking about here. I talk very fast and I consolidate it down. Long form stuff on YouTube too. I've been pushing, did some advanced scouting stuff there. That's fun. The Substack, I don't exactly know what I'm doing the off season with it, but I got a decent amount of subs this year. I'm hoping to grow it again early next year. It's a lot of fun. There's actually like 12 people from front offices on that Substack too. So if you want some validation of like some people actually think what I'm saying is not complete BS, then that's maybe one of the points. But yeah, anywhere you live, I'm probably there. So check me out.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for your time. Best of luck as the regular season winds down. And like I said, it'd be fun. I'm rooting to play the Cubs in the NLDS. So I'm rooting that we meet each other.
I owe you if we do. That sounds great.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for watching. As always, we appreciate you. You can subscribe, ring the notification bell here, and we will see you down the road the next few days with tons and tons of NLDS content. Enjoy the rest of your day, and as always, go Dodgers.